Hello, my name is Brian Wary, and I'm the developer of TransMIDifier. As a composer and user of virtual instruments, I like being able to switch among different articulations of a certain instrument from a single MIDI track, such as switching among a string section's articulations such as legato, staccato, pizzicato, etc. Some virtual instruments and sample players support this articulation switching, others do not. I created TransMIDifier to enable switching among different virtual instrument articulations from a single MIDI track, no matter what the instrument or sample player. During development, I discovered and implemented many additional features that make TransMIDifier far more powerful than just an articulation switcher. In this video, I'll explain and demonstrate some of the key features of TransMIDifier using some basic examples. At its most basic level, TransMIDifier is a sort of directed MIDI data distributor. MIDI data received from one channel of an input port can be selectively rerouted among many different output ports and channels, effectively redirecting the MIDI stream on the fly. The output redirection can be done via key switches or program changes. Since TransMIDifier is a standalone application for Windows and Mac OS X, it can work with all sequencers, digital audio workstations, virtual instruments, and MIDI gear. TransMIDifier only deals with MIDI, not audio, but as you'll see, it can enable new and interesting sonic possibilities. Let's take a look at the interface. On the left side of the TransMIDifier window are the inputs. Each input receives MIDI data from a specific channel of a MIDI input port. The outputs belonging to the selected input are displayed on the right side of the TransMIDifier window. Each input has one or more outputs, but only one output is active at a time. The active output is the only one that processes the MIDI data received by the input. Each output has a specific activation event, either a certain key switch or program change number. An output is made active when its activation event is received by the input. Each output has one or more patches. The patch is where the MIDI output port and channel is specified. The active output passes along all MIDI data that it receives from its input to all of its patches simultaneously. But since each patch can target a different MIDI output port and channel, it's possible to create interesting instrument combinations. Patches can also transform the MIDI data they receive before sending it out, which is a great way to customize the behavior of different instruments according to your needs. To better learn about TransMIDifier's capabilities, let's build a basic setup. In this scenario, which is probably most common, TransMIDifier will sit between the MIDI sequencer and virtual instruments, acting as a sort of middleman. MIDI will be sent from the sequencer to TransMIDifier, then TransMIDifier will send MIDI on to the virtual instruments. I'm going to use TransMIDifier to not only switch among many different virtual instrument patches from a single MIDI track, but also to create some interesting instrument combinations. First, I'll create a new MIDI track in the sequencer, called violas, with input coming from all MIDI ports and channels and outputting to TransMIDifier input 1, channel 1. Now in TransMIDifier, I'll create a new setup which will automatically create the first input and its first output. I'll call this input violas and specify that it is to receive MIDI from TransMIDifier input 1, channel 1. On my sampler, I have an instance of Kontakt loaded containing a variety of different articulations played by a viola section: legato, tremolo, staccato, pizzicato, harmonics, and trills. The next step is to configure the first output to target the first patch in my Kontakt instance, which is the legato articulation. First, I'll call this output legato. Since I prefer using program changes instead of key switches, I'll set the activation method to program change, and since this is the first articulation, I'll set its program change number to 1. I typically name the patch according to the name of the virtual instrument patch being targeted, which in this case is viola's full leg. The instance of Kontakt I have loaded is receiving MIDI on port VEP strings port 1, and the legato articulation is on channel 1, so I'll set this patch to output to port VEP strings port 1, channel 1. Now when I play on my keyboard, I hear the viola section legato. Next up is the tremolo articulation. First, I'll create a new output and call it tremolo. I'll also go ahead and name its default patch accordingly. Notice that this new tremolo output is the active output. Since the default output port and channel in a new output is one channel above the previous output on the same MIDI port, this new output is already targeting the correct instrument, so I can go ahead and play on my keyboard to play the tremolo articulation. I can now switch between the legato and tremolo articulations by pressing program change buttons 1 and 2 on my MIDI controller. If I had chosen to use key switches, I could switch between these articulations using their respective keys. I'll now go ahead and create outputs for the rest of the articulations: staccato, pizzicato, harmonics, and trills. I now have 7 different articulations that I can switch among from a single MIDI track using program changes. I'm going to collapse the output panels for now by clicking on the little triangles next to the names. You can expand and collapse all the outputs at once by holding the Shift key while clicking on the triangle. This viola section setup is fine, but there are a few changes I'd like to make. The first change is with the trills. The trills articulation from this sample library uses key switches internally to select between whole step and half step trills, A1 for half step and B1 for whole step. I'd like to separate these out into separate switchable outputs without having to use those key switches. I'll start by making the existing output the one for the half step trills. First, I'll rename it to half step trills. Next, I'm going to create a note on initializer for the note A1. An initializer is an event that is sent at the time the parent output is made active for the purpose of setting up the instrument however you like. In this case, when the half-step trills output is made active, an A1 note will be sent to the instrument, which will put it into half-step trills mode. I'll also add a note off initializer for A1 to simulate the quick pressing and releasing of the A1 key. Now we'll create a new output for the whole step trills. Since the whole step trills output is actually going to be targeting the same instrument as the half step trills output, we'll just copy the half step trills patch and replace the patch in the whole step trills output. The only change we need to make is to send out B1 note on and off messages to put the instrument into whole step trills mode. I can now switch between half step and whole step trills using program changes. Another change I'd like to make is in the harmonics output. All of the long note articulations use the mod wheel for dynamics, except for harmonics. The harmonics articulation has a slower attack and release, so it sort of fades in and out, but the loudness is controlled by the note velocity. I'd like it to respond to the mod wheel to more closely mimic the other long note articulations. To do this, I'm going to use a series of transforms to alter the MIDI data that gets received by the harmonics articulation. First, I'm going to add a velocity map transform to change whatever velocity I play to a single velocity value representing the loudest I want the harmonics to get. To do this, I'll right-click in the mapping area and choose Ceiling, which maps all incoming velocities to the maximum velocity of 127. That's probably too loud, so I'll hold down Shift and use the mouse wheel to bring the velocity down a bit. There, that sounds loud enough. Since I want to control the loudness of the harmonics with the mod wheel, next I'll add a change CC number transform to change the mod wheel or CC1 values I enter to be CC7, which is a volume control. Now I can control the loudness of the harmonics using the mod wheel. This is pretty good, but I want to make one more modification. In the current setup, with the mod wheel all the way down at 0, the harmonics articulation will be totally silent. Instead, I'd like it to be really quiet when the mod wheel is all the way down, but not totally silent. To achieve this, I'll add a CC map transform and remap the CC7 values such that an incoming value of 0 will be mapped to something a little bit higher. You can freely draw in your own curves using the left mouse button, or use the middle mouse button for linear ramps over a range of values. So now I've got the mod wheel all the way down making the harmonics really quiet, and the mod wheel all the way up makes the harmonics as loud as they're going to get. So far, all of the outputs we've created only have a single patch, and thus only target a single articulation. Let's create a new output that targets multiple articulations at once. The specific output combination I have in mind will use the staccato and legato articulations simultaneously to produce a short staccato attack in response to a note's velocity, with the sustaining note having its dynamics controlled via the mod wheel. First, I'll create a new output and call it staccato plus legato. Next, I'll simply copy the staccato patch and use it instead of the default patch, then copy the legato patch and add it on. This gets the staccato plus legato combination happening, but there's one tweak I'd like to make. For very low note velocities, I don't want to hear the staccato note, so I'll use a velocity filter transform to ignore notes whose velocities are below, say, 40. Now I have the staccato attacks on the strong notes, but I can still play soft legato passages without hearing the staccato notes. Let's create one more useful combination. I'd like to control the intensity of the tremolo using a MIDI controller, so to be able to smoothly transition from no tremolo to full tremolo. The library I'm using doesn't have an instrument patch that enables controlling the degree of the tremolo, but I can crossfade between the legato and tremolo articulations, which should achieve a similar effect. First, I'll create a new output and call it legato to tremolo crossfade. I've already got patches that target the legato and tremolo articulations, so I'll go ahead and copy those and add them in. I've got a MIDI fader mapped to CC20 available, so I'll use that for the crossfading between legato and tremolo, with the mod wheel being used to control the dynamics of both articulations, as it already does. To use CC20 as a crossfade, I'm going to add a change CC number transform to the tremolo patch to change the incoming CC20 messages to CC7, which is the volume control. After that, I'll add a CC map transform to remap the CC7 values to a sine ramp up. I'm going to add the same transforms to the legato patch, but I'm going to reverse the sine ramp up for the legato, which will result in all legato with the controller all the way down, and all tremolo with the controller all the way up. The reason I'm using sine ramps instead of the default linear values is to produce an approximation of an equal power crossfade, which should keep the output loudness of the two articulations roughly the same throughout the controller range. Now I can use the CC20 fader to control the tremolo intensity, while CC1 still controls the overall dynamics. This concludes the first TransMIDifier intro video. I hope it helped to illustrate some of the basic concepts and features of the application. Future videos will contain more details about the interface, demos of all available initializers and transforms, and some additional examples of creative sonic possibilities. TransMIDifier is available for Windows and Mac OS X, and best of all, it's free. If you haven't already, head on over to bewaryprods.com to download and try it out. Thanks for watching.